This is the second podcast on mid-19th century reformers. We're going to pick up where we left off with the Dred Scott court case. And as we were previously discussing, the Dred Scott court case involved Dred Scott, a slave, who was owned by a military medical doctor, and he was moved around the United States as we see here on the chart. But at one point here at the fourth stop, they're in Wisconsin, a free state, and this went to the Supreme Court. Can a slave be brought to free states? And ultimately, it was decided by the Chief Justice and the other justices, Roger B. Taney, the Chief Justice at this time, that slaves were property and that they would move with their owners. Ultimately, this led to the rise that perhaps slavery in America didn't really exist just in slave states, but existed everywhere. The next great issue in the United States at this time came in 1858. It's what we call the Lincoln-Douglas debates, the most highly contested senatorial race that we had. Abraham Lincoln was opposing the incumbent, Stephen Douglas. And Douglas, the creator, as seen here, of the Compromise of 1850, co-author of that, and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, where he believed in popular sovereignty, where the people should vote on whether or not their state would be slave or free. Now, Abraham Lincoln opposed this. He believed that our nation should be one or the other. He had more or less a unified vision of this, and this was known as the House Divided speech. And what he meant by this was that our nation could not exist being half one or half the other. We had to be whole. And ultimately, this debate throughout, as seen up here in 7 different spots in Illinois, gave rise to the idea that Abraham Lincoln, if he ever obtained any other position, would end our nation of slavery. And this scared Southerners, especially 2 years later when he becomes president. He does lose the senatorial position here with Douglas, but ultimately wins the presidency 2 years later. Perhaps one of the culminating events illustrating the violence that existed had to do with John Brown. And John Brown had really perhaps one of the most outlandish of ideas, but he was going to raid Harpers Ferry. And Harpers Ferry was a U.S. arsenal, and his plan was to take over the U.S. arsenal at Harpers Ferry, Virginia, get the weapons, and distribute these weapons to the slaves throughout the South. Now, this gives rise to the question, was the man crazy or was he a martyr? Because this didn't seem like a realistic plan. Ultimately, the attempt was foiled. He was actually arrested by Colonel Robert E. Lee, and he was put to death by hanging. This gave rise to the song about John Brown, and it was written by Julia Ward Howe, seen here, down at the bottom, and her song ultimately became the Battle Hymn of the Republic. Coupled with all of these reforms, perhaps the most important one was the beginning of the women's suffrage movement. And the women's suffrage movement is an effort to obtain the right to vote. And this began in the mid-1850s, and this ultimately won't happen until the year 1919 with the 19th Amendment. But it begins here, and we have to really put a great deal of significance onto the work of people like Lucretia Mott, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and of course Harriet Tubman. And these three women did so much. Lucretia Mott here, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Harriet Tubman. They did so much to move forward, not just the rights of women, but the rights of all people. And ultimately, this is the conclusion of mid-19th century reformers.